unprecedented period in human history. Pornography and masturbation, especially online, cryptocurrency, sports betting, the rising rates of depression and anxiety that we're seeing today caused by dopamine overload. Pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain's opposite sides of a balance. First and most important rule is the balance wants to remain level. And what happens in addiction is that that part of the brain gets hijacked by our drug. My name is Anna Lemke. I'm a psychiatrist and also a professor of psychiatry and addiction medicine at Stanford University's School of Medicine. I really liken addiction today as the modern plague. I think it is the biggest problem facing modern humans now and for the foreseeable future. We have arrived at an unprecedented period in human history where most of us have all our survival needs met, and we are surrounded by many different forms of highly reinforcing substances and behaviors, making us all more vulnerable to the problem of addiction than ever before in human history. Yeah, so she originally came to see me for anxiety. She was having a lot of anxiety in her everyday life. She was depressed and she wanted help with that. And what I discovered in talking with her was that she spent most of every day plugged into some kind of device, either watching something or listening to something. Even going from her dorm room to her classroom, she would always be plugged into some kind of device. So, again, the sort of bigger hypothesis in my book, Dopamination, is that the rising rates of depression and anxiety that we're seeing today are potentially caused by dopamine overload. That is to say, by constantly bombarding our reward pathways with these hits, large and small, of dopamine, what we're doing is causing our brain to have to compensate by downregulating dopamine production and transmission into a chronic dopamine deficit state, which is very similar to depression. So my suggestion to her, instead of prescribing a pill or recommending a particular type of psychotherapy, I just recommended, why don't you try unplugging for a while? Just take the devices and put them away, at least for some period of time in the day. So she agreed to try that, and she came back about a month later, and she said, well, I did it, and it was hard, and it was the hardest thing about it is that it was really boring. I was really, really bored. And that's a big reason that people both use substances and behaviors that are addictive, and a big reason that people relapse when they're trying to get out of their addiction, because suddenly they have all this time and they don't know what to do with it. But then she said something that was really moving. She said, yeah, but after a while, I just let myself sit with that state of boredom and didn't try to fight it. And gradually I started to notice the trees, which is to say that she started to notice the world around her. And I think that's really important, because what happens, especially in our digital world with all of our portable devices, we get really locked into this space that is sort of inside our own heads and between our own heads and the digital universe. But we completely forget about the real world that we're living in. And so unplugging, although it was painful and she experienced the boredom of withdrawal, and boredom is a painful emotion, after a while, it also allowed her to tune outward and become a part of the world that we live in. And with that came a lot more joy and a lot less anxiety and a lot more feeling connected. So dopamine is a chemical that we make in our brains. Our brains is basically a combination of a bunch of wires that conduct electrical signals. But those wires, called neurons, do not in fact touch end to end. There's a little gap between them, and that gap is called the synapse. And that gap allows for finer tuning control of those electrical circuits. And neurotransmitters are chemicals that bridge that gap between neurons, allowing for that fine-tuned control. And dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters. You might think about it as that the presynaptic neuron is a pitcher in baseball, and the postsynaptic neuron is a catcher, and the dopamine is the ball. So the presynaptic neuron throws the ball to the pitcher, to the catcher, who catches it with their mitt. That mitt is the postsynaptic receptor. And then once the dopamine binds the receptor or the catcher's mitt, it continues an electrical signal, or it inhibits an electrical signal, depending upon the neurotransmitter and that particular circuit and how it works. Dopamine is essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in that process, but it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing substances and behaviors, and it's become a kind of common currency for neuroscientists to measure the addictive nature of a substance or behavior. You know, the extremes of addiction are always shocking because what happens is that our brain confuses our drug of choice for something that we need for survival. It's not that dopamine is evil. Dopamine is necessary for survival. If we didn't have dopamine, we wouldn't be motivated to do anything, right? It's our incentive neurochemical. And we need it. We've needed it to survive over millions and millions of years, because when we do the work to go find a scarce resource, food, clothing, shelter, we get a release of dopamine, and that feels good. And that's how our brains and how dopamine gets us to do the things we need to do to survive. But what happens in addiction is that that part of the brain gets hijacked by our drug, which we then mistake for something that we need for survival. So in the extreme cases of addiction to whatever it is, people will give up things that are very valuable to them: relationships, jobs, school, reputation. They'll go against their moral compass and do things that are against their values because they're so consumed with that physiologic drive to restore homeostasis and get more dopamine. And again, it's not because they're having a good time and it feels good. It's because they're really, really suffering and in that dopamine deficit state and trying to bring themselves out of that excruciating state of being. So I've seen, very severe sex and masturbation and love addictions. I've seen very severe drug and alcohol addictions. I've seen people who go into, millions of dollars of debt because of gambling addictions. So I've seen, the extremes of where this disease can take people. What happens in the brain as we become addicted is that we actually change these reward pathways. And in order to understand how we change them, it's essential to understand that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So they're processed in the same part of the brain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So you imagine a beam on a central fulcrum, like a seesaw or a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. That represents how we process pleasure and pain, which is to say, when we experience pleasure, that balance tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the other. But there are certain rules governing this balance, and the first and most important rule is the balance wants to remain level, so that with any deviation from a level balance, whether to the side of pleasure or pain, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance. And our brains do that first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was before going back to the resting position. So just to give you an example, as I talk about in the book, I developed a mild addiction to romance novels. I was reading them compulsively late into the night, chain reading, not getting enough sleep, reading them at parties, at some point taking them to work and reading them in between patients. And I got to a point where I didn't want to do anything else. I just waited for that moment in the day when I could read my romance novels. And we define addiction as the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. And I was, through my behavior, harming myself and in a way harming other people because I wasn't taking care of myself, getting enough sleep. And I was harming others and my relationship with others in that I wasn't present for my children or my husband or my patients in the way that I really want to be because I was so consumed with these novels or this escape fantasy fiction. So what happened to my brain, and what happens to everybody's brain, is that when I would read romance novels, I would get the release of dopamine, our reward neurotransmitter, in this dedicated pathway in my brain, and my balance would tilt to the side of pleasure. But no sooner does that happen than our brain adapts to that increased dopamine firing by down-regulating dopamine transmission, not just to baseline, but below baseline. I like to imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it there, so they stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the after effect, the hangover, or that moment of coming to the end of a chapter and having a really intense urge to read another chapter. Even though I'm exhausted, I should go to sleep, it's 3 a.m. Now, that's these gremlins, they're now on the pain side of the balance. Now, if I wait and I put that novel away, I stop it, and I will feel distress and craving because I've tilted my balance to the side of pain. But, after a matter of minutes or hours, those gremlins will hop off the pain side of the balance and homeostasis will be restored. That is, a level balance will be restored. But what if I don't stop? What if I continue to consume more and more over days to weeks to months to years? Those gremlins slowly accumulate. And now I've got enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room, and they are camped out there. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. And now we've entered addicted brain, right? Which is the second rule of the balance. With repeated exposure to the same or similar stimulus, that initial deviation to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but that after response to pain gets stronger and longer. And after a period of time, essentially what we do is we've changed our hedonic or our joy set point. And now we're in addicted brain. Now we need our drug not to feel good, but just to bring the balance up to the level position and stop feeling bad, right? And tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. We can tell ourselves, I don't want to do this activity anymore. But when we give up that reinforcing substance or behavior, with all those gremlins accumulated on the pain side of the balance, we smash down to the side of pain. We feel restless, we feel anxious. And that's in fact what happened to me as I realized that this habit of mine had become problematic. I decided to abstain from reading any romance novels for a month, and I was shocked at how difficult it was for me. I would typically read them in the evening as I was going to bed, and I found myself very anxious, very restless, unable to sleep for hours. So, I had this sort of counter response, and that's withdrawal, right? But as time went on, the longer I abstained, gradually that got better, and by the time I got to 4 weeks, I was able to fall asleep naturally without reading. In other words, abstaining allowed those neuroadaptation gremlins eventually to get the memo, right? That, okay, we're not getting this source of dopamine. It's okay to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. But initially, it's very difficult to do. Today we see people getting addicted to all kinds of things. Of course, there are the traditional drugs. The top of that list is nicotine products, alcohol products, and cannabis products. But we also see more and more people getting addicted to opioids, including pharmaceutical-grade opioids in pill form, as well as other pharmaceutical drugs like benzodiazepines, like Xanax, and other sedatives and stimulants that are made in a laboratory. We're also seeing many people get addicted to behaviors. So this is something we call behavioral addictions or process addictions. That is where we get addicted not to something that we ingest, but something that we do. We've known for a long time that people can get addicted to gambling. That's been around for hundreds of years, the awareness of gambling addiction or pathological gambling. But we're seeing much more pathological gambling, as well as many new process addictions to pornography and masturbation, especially online. We're seeing a video game addiction or gaming disorder. We're seeing shopping addictions. We're seeing people get addicted to things like chess or reading or investing in cryptocurrency. So sports betting is a huge addiction that's taken hold. So really almost every aspect of human life today has the potential for addiction because of 4 factors. It's more potent, meaning that it releases a lot more of our reward chemicals in the brain. It's more accessible. We can get it anywhere, anytime. And we know that one of the biggest risk factors for addiction is simple access to that drug. It's more bountiful, meaning that there's more of it. Something like TikTok never runs out. We don't even have to go across the street to the store to buy more. It's just there in an infinite quantity. And then novelty is a big one. As we develop tolerance to drugs and they stop working, we need new and improved and slightly different forms of them. And we can do that by combining drugs together or changing the chemical structure or a certain aspect of a digital drug to make it similar to what we've liked before, but a little bit different. So potency, access, quantity, and novelty. In my book, I talk about the framework for tackling addictive behaviors, whether to a substance or a behavior. And it really does begin, number one, with awareness, just becoming aware of the behavior itself, which is easier said than done because our mind has an interesting way of not seeing what we're doing or minimizing what we're doing or minimizing the negative impact of our addictive behavior. So big, important first step is just becoming aware. And we can become aware simply by writing down what we're using, how much and how often in a journal or a workbook, or telling somebody else, a good friend, a counselor, a therapist, a psychiatrist, a parent, a sibling, somebody we trust, what we're doing, how much and how often. I often recommend something called the timeline follow-back method, where you take a given week and you just count backwards from today and you say, okay, what did I use yesterday? How about the day before that, the day before that? And you go for 7 days until you have a 7-day measurement of, okay, let's say I was playing video games. For example, a patient might say to me, I played 6 hours of video games yesterday. And the day before that, I played 10 hours. And the day before that, I played 4 hours. And then you add it all up. And when we do that, it might come down to, wow, I played 50 hours of video games this week, right? And that can then make an impact in a way that it won't make if we just say, today was I just played a lot today, but I normally don't play. But when we really add it up and look at it, it's like, oh my gosh, 50, that's more than a full-time job, right? I'm spending more than a full-time job number of hours playing video games. And then all of a sudden it becomes real to us in a way that it's not when it's just sort of pinging around in the dark recesses of our minds. Then the next step is, I have a whole dopamine framework, but the next step is then thinking about, well, why do I do this, right? What do I get from it? And for me, with the romance novels, it was just a wonderful escape where I didn't have to think my own thoughts or have my own worries. I could just forget the world for a while. And for a lot of people, that's what they're going for. But people have different reasons. Some people use it to manage anxiety or stress or to help them sleep or to help them wake up. There are many different reasons.